so usually I talk about armed European martial arts, and I sometimes talk about non-European martial arts, Asian martial arts and so on. But my specialisation obviously is in weapon-based martial arts, mostly swords, but in actual fact HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts, covers a much wider range of things than just swords. Clearly it covers many different weapons in many different time periods, and it also covers unarmed martial arts as well. And some unarmed martial arts have a modern descendants in the forms of modern boxing and so on, and certain forms of modern wrestling. But they equally have a historical basis as well, and there are many documented styles of historical wrestling and so on. And so I've got a guest here who knows a lot more about these things, and this is Martin Austwick of the English Martial Arts Academy, known to his friends and family as Oz. And he can be found online on Facebook and the Scholar Forum and various other forums out there. So first of all I'd like to welcome Oz and basically ask you, so what are examples of historical European unarmed martial arts, and what sort of varieties are there and what kind of things do you study?
Okay, well the first thing is a bit of a disclaimer in that I specifically study English martial arts, so there are all sorts of European wrestling systems out there, but I'm certainly not an expert on those. What we study is classical pugilism, which is the forerunner of modern boxing, and also we look at some traditional folk wrestling. Essentially every area in the country used to have its own specific style of wrestling. Some of those are still alive now. If you go to fairs in Cornwall, you'll see guys practicing Cornish wrestling. Most of them have died out. Lancashire had a very brutal style of wrestling which became known as catch as catch can, which eventually evolved into modern freestyle wrestling, and we do a little bit of that, but predominantly classical pugilism, which is essentially boxing without the rules and without the gloves.
Right, okay, so that's great. So essentially you've got wrestling and boxing. Do you know any particular reason why they were separated into different things, or were they at one point part of the same thing? Or?
Well, absolutely, yeah. Originally, classical pugilism was full of grappling, it was full of throws. In its earliest form, there were essentially no rules at all. It was a fight. Anything went, and that was just the way it was. It was only when a chap called Jack Broughton killed another boxer in the ring in 1741 that he decided to introduce some rules to try and make sure that didn't happen again. He didn't introduce many rules. The only two that are of any relevance were no taking hold of a man below the waist and no striking a man when he was down. So even at that point, this is in 1743, anything went except striking a man when he was down. So you could still use knees or elbows, you could still grapple, you could headbutt, you could pick them up and throw them to the floor. So yeah, originally they were one and the same.
I mean, for my own part, looking when I was researching a lot in medieval martial arts, I found that there were lots of rules in regards to fencing and fencing schools in medieval English cities, but equally wrestling was mentioned as well, and they used to, in the 13th, 14th century, it was banned. There are specific edicts banning wrestling competitions within cities, presumably because they were sources of public unrest and so on. People would get maybe worked up, a lot of drinking was probably to be had. And so they actually said if you're going to have wrestling competitions or even wrestling practice, do it outside the city limits, and this was the same with fencing competitions as well. And in fact later on with jousting and archery. Obviously archery isn't very safe in a city, so all of these things were sort of pushed out. And in London, for example, Smithfields was the place where wrestling, fencing, jousting, archery, all of these things were traditionally done. And incidentally also where people were hanged, potentially where trial by combat was held. Although in London's case there were very few trial by combats after about the 12th, 13th century, I think. For my part, coming from a medieval sort of martial arts background, I think perhaps the wrestling was focused on because of armoured fighting. So a common question that comes up is why isn't there much punching in medieval treatises where there's unarmed martial arts shown, it's usually wrestling. What do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the simple fact is, if we've both got swords, then if I'm going to hit you, I'll be better off hitting you with the sword than hitting you with my fist. Now, there's nothing to stop me using a pommel, or later on when we have complex hilts, to use the hilt to strike you. But I'm more likely to kill you by sticking 3 feet of steel through you than by hitting you in the face, however hard I do it.
Yeah.
So, clearly, if you're going to look at striking, then it makes sense to look at striking with a sword. But it's far easier to hit somebody if they're lying on the ground.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to put some forms of grappling, some forms of wrestling into your sword arts.
Yeah, so even with armed martial arts, wrestling often, especially in the early arts, seems to form an intrinsic part of it, and is quite, can be quite important in longsword fighting, or even perhaps pole axe fighting and so on, and of course in armoured fighting, where wrestling is a very important tool. Okay, I think we'll leave it there, and I've got some more questions, but we'll deal with them in separate videos. Thank you.
Thank you.